Welcome, everybody, to this situational briefing here on the Benjamin Anthony Show, a product of the MirYam Institute. I'm your host, Benjamin Anthony, CEO of the MirYam Institute, and I'm delighted to be joined by Ruth Wasserman-Lande, who is a former member of Knesset, former deputy ambassador to Egypt on behalf of the State of Israel, a prolific commentator on both the international media and the Israeli media, and a very valued voice and colleague here at the MirYam Institute. Ruth, it's a pleasure to have you. Thank you for being with me today.
My pleasure. Thank you, Benjamin, for having me.
So I want to refer to my notes today. Here we're recording on Tuesday, April 7th, 2026. We're about 8.5 hours from the expiration of the deadline put forward by President Donald Trump with regard to his readiness if a ceasefire, or rather if the opening of the Strait of Hormuz is not brought about by the Iranians, that thereafter he will begin to essentially blow up everything and anything in Iran. He's used very bellicose language in that regard. We'll wait and see what happens when that deadline arrives and whether it's adhered to or whether it's run right through by the Iranians. But before I get to that, I just want to make mention of a couple of points to our listeners. Firstly, we at the MirYam Institute are deeply grateful and thankful for the successful retrieval of the air crew in Iran. We know that the personnel landed in 2 separate locations. There was a very daring mission. Others will talk about that at length in other programs and on other shows to rescue the second individual. But we just wanted to say, as Israelis, we are deeply thankful and thankful to God, even I would say in my name, for the successful retrieval of both members of that crew. In addition, I also want to mention that we are deeply saddened by the loss of an entire family in Haifa in northern Israel. They were struck by a munition fired into Israel. Those 4 members of that family who have been snuffed out are Vladimir Gershowitz and his wife Lena Ostrovsky-Gershowitz, their son Dmitry Gershowitz and his wife Lucille Jane Gershowitz. May those by whom they are mourned be bound up among the mourners of Zion. Tragic, tragic news. Turning now to this situational briefing, Ruth, I want to present, if I may, an overarching consideration that I'd like our listeners and viewers to be escorted by as we go through some of the points currently playing out over the course of this current conflict. And that is the notion of mowing the lawn, and why we have to, in my view, and you'll tell me if you disagree, we have to make sure that the dynamic between Israel and Iran does not prove itself over a long enough time frame to be, in essence, the application of the mowing of the lawn, but on steroids. So what is the mowing of the lawn for our listeners? Well, the mowing of the lawn was a very inelegant, I found objectionable phrase that was put forward by the Israeli defense establishment in the context of the Gaza Strip as Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and some others fired rockets repeatedly after the disengagement from Gaza in 2005 toward the state of Israel. And the response would be that there were partial operations by the Israel Defense Forces to snuff out the source of that fire, but not to completely extinguish it, meaning we never went in and disarmed Hamas, we never went in and brought about an end to their reign inside the Gaza Strip. And as a consequence, those partial operations, which were termed a mowing of the lawn, that took place in 2008, 2009 with Operation Cast Lead, 2012 Operation Pillar of Defense, 2014 Operation Protective Edge, they were escorted by the gradual but unmistakable increase in the trajectory of the munitions from Gaza by Hamas, and also the increase of terror that could be wielded against Israeli civilians. And just to give you some context for that, when first Hamas started to fire rockets, there were about 1 million Israelis within the southern enclave of the State of Israel who were proven to be within range. Those included the residents of Ashkelon, Ashdod, even Beersheba, and suddenly the city of Sderot, which came to prominence by way of its unfortunate location firmly within the crosshairs of Hamas's projectiles. Over time, that trajectory increased. And suddenly, Ruth, we started to hear about Jerusalem being in range and then Tel Aviv being in range. And latterly, right around 2012, if memory serves, we heard about Haifa, the northern city of Israel, being well within range. So, in effect, as a result of mowing the lawn rather than uprooting the weeds, if I can put it that way, we saw that gradually 2/3 of the Jewish population of the Jewish state were in range of this terror activity. And to overlay that onto an American map, it meant essentially that were there to be incoming rockets from America's East Coast, everything up to and including the state of Colorado would have been within range of that fire, a situation that's completely untenable. That is the outcome of mowing of the lawn, something that I always opposed. I'm very concerned, and I'd like your thoughts on this, Ruth, that if there is a premature ending of hostilities, temporary ending of hostilities, temporary ceasefire with regard to Iran, we're going to see that mowing of the lawn on steroids, meaning as a result of an incomplete set of missions against Iran, we will, every few years, have to go to the shelters as Iran sharpens its focus, increases its ability, recovers some of its military ability to attack us and to terrorize us both in Israel and abroad, hitting soft targets, and find ourselves in the midst of a far more macabre and dangerous mowing of the lawn. What do you say to that?
So first of all, I must agree with everything that you said. Mowing of the lawn is certainly something that is extremely unfavorable to the Israeli population. And just one little comment, it's not only the Jewish population within Israeli cities and towns, but most certainly the Christian population, the Arab Muslim population, the Druze population, every single citizen, civilian, and or inhabitant, including foreign workers and visitors, are all under fire and have been so for years. Regarding the current situation and war with Iran, I feel that this is not going to be a mowing of the lawn, and not because of the suffering of the Israeli civilians, nor because of the suffering of the Iranian civilians, the 92 million Iranian civilians, and or the little bit over than 10 million Israeli civilians, but rather because of the interest of the United States of America. The United States of America, to me, and to my analysis, went into this extremely significant act of war in order to protect the interests of the United States of America, the hegemony internationally, and the stronghold that it has and needs to have and maintain over sources of energy that have been held, and thereby holding the world, in a manner of speaking, hostage by the Islamic Republic of Iran and its absolutely insanely ideological leadership. Because of the sanctions, the correct and rightful sanctions imposed upon Iran, the only way it could circumvent those sanctions and still earn money on and on top of the heads of its own civilians in order to promote its absolutely insane imperialistic objectives, really feeding the Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad with a lot of money, creating huge towns, underground towns, not tunnels, towns of weaponry and armament, insane objectives in order to infiltrate par excellence the West, including first and foremost the United States of America. But above all of that, it was actually selling energy and its sources and assets to the Chinese for a much lesser cost, thereby allowing the Chinese to have a clear advantage for years over the West and the United States, which is something that is or was impossible for the United States to maintain. And it was about to lose its leverage and hegemony economically and energy-wise. without a doubt. And that is the reason, not the civilians of Israel, despite the fact that we had suffered a lot, and not the horrid experiences of the civilians of Iran, be they the Kurds or the Iranians, the Persians, or the Baluchis or the Azeris, it doesn't matter. It is the vital interest of the United States of America and the holding on to the energy sources. That is why he went in, and that is why this will not be a mowing of the lawn operation, because President Trump cannot come out of that operation without that interest in place. If he does that, this no man's land, which is currently the state of affairs in the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is already not the Islamic Republic of Iran, but the IRCG Republic of Iran, is going to fall into the hands of China, Russia, and the extremist Sunni axis led by Turkey and Qatar. So there is no way that he can come out of it without having his hands in the United States of America in control of the passageways which had been blocked and the energy sources, and to have a regime or some kind of a leadership, even if it is transitional, that sees eye to eye with that goal or objective. That is a United States of America goal first and foremost, not because of Israeli suffering, not because of Iranian suffering. And that is why I do not foresee that any agreement will be signed, apart from the fact, Benjamin, that I think there's no one to sign such an agreement with. And if you want, I will gladly elaborate on why I think that. But no, I don't think that this particular issue in Iran, not Lebanon, not Gaza, not Judea and Samaria, but in Iran will not be a mowing of the lawn kind of operation.
So I really thank you for that answer, and I happen to be in agreement with you. I believe that, well, I'm in partial agreement with you, because I believe that it need not end up being a mowing of the lawn operation, but I'm concerned that it could end up being, despite the fact that it doesn't need to have that outcome and that end. Thank you also for pointing out the fact that, for example, when Hamas was firing into southern Israel, if I remember correctly, the number of Arab Christian residents in that area that were regularly being fired upon in southern Israel was somewhere between 90 and 120,000 civilians, citizens of the state of Israel. You're absolutely right to point that out. And I'm pleased with the progress being made. We're going to talk about that militarily against Iran. It's something that goes somewhat unheralded, I think. It's somewhat taken for granted by much of the commentariat. That's a mistake, of course. But much of the next stage is going to come down to what eventuates from this ultimatum from President Donald Trump. As we said, it's supposed to kick in at 8 p.m. Eastern time today. Now, Ruth, this ultimatum has generated something of a feverish effort to bring about a 45-day ceasefire brokered by, of all people, the Pakistanis. For the folks at home, remember the Pakistanis share a border with Iran. They're one of the few countries in the region that the Iranians have deliberately, of course, not struck out against, in no small part, I'm sure, because they are a nuclear power, and there are other reasons at play as well. But the Pakistanis have gone after this 45-day ceasefire, and what irritates me about what the Americans seem to be saying in response, according to reporting, is that the negotiations at play right now are a two-step process. And the disparity between the Iranians and the Americans, among other things, is that the Iranians want to leave the issue of reopening the Straits of Hormuz and the end of their nuclear pursuits, whether they admit it, don't admit it, doesn't matter. They want to leave that to phase two. And the Americans want to see both of those issues tackled in phase one. So obviously there's a dissonance there between the negotiating parties. But what disappoints me is that this seems to be a repetition, hence my concern about the potential mowing of the lawn outcome, this seems to be a repetition of the negotiating tactics of the American negotiating team, Jared Kushner, Steve Witkoff, and others. In other words, to try and get something while not demanding that the powers that be disarm. We've seen the lack of disarmament by Hezbollah. We saw a ceasefire that was brokered some months ago. At the time, I said that that ceasefire was absolute nonsense, couldn't possibly hold, and shouldn't be heralded or celebrated. Here we are in the midst of very intense fighting against Hezbollah, they not having disarmed. And we've seen also inside Gaza that despite the best efforts and the formation of the board of peace, Hamas has not disarmed. Incidentally, they never agreed to disarm, regardless of what was said by the American president at the time and by the negotiators. I'm concerned that we're going to see a repeat, whereby there is phase one, whatever that includes or does not include, and we never quite get to phase two, which is a full end to hostilities because of the disarming of the entity on the other side, in this case, Iran. What do you think about that?
So I am concerned together with you, of course, but my analysis is again a little bit more optimistic. I don't tend to be usually optimistic, but I am on this front again, very simply because the interest of the United States is to get its hands on these assets, these sources of energy, to stop the unfair advantage for China and the Chinese, and to return this clear advantage and hegemony and leadership to the United States of America. Hence, to stop midway would not allow for that objective to be reached. That's number one. Number two, let's just analyze for a second, Benjamin, whom we are talking to. So, yes, there are voices and comments and declarations made. Jared Kushner, Steve Witkoff, other negotiators, the Pakistanis, and so on, saying all sorts of things. And then there are the declarations of the president, whom we had seen, says a few things, a little bit with a point of confusing everyone. I think this is a strategy that is used again and again, quite in a positive manner. He did manage to confuse a lot of people, and a lot of people are indeed pessimistic in the same manner that you've just described, fearing that there will be an agreement. But there is no one to talk to, Benjamin. There is no higher echelon of decision making currently in the Islamic Republic of Iran. The entire decision making strata of that leadership is gone. The remaining, I would call them the remnants, are not the military, the Iranian military, but rather the IRCG, which had been formed to keep and maintain that leadership, which is no longer. So these people are Shiite extremist ideologues that have 180 small signs to promote before their Messiah or Mahdi in the Shiite Islamic ideology and thought comes into being. And they strongly, sincerely believe that and indoctrinate their followers in a very significant manner to believe that. And there are a few million people in the 92 million Republic of Iran that believe in that ideology and follow that ideology. Some of these signs, Benjamin, include the destruction of the Kaaba in Saudi Arabia, the destruction of the Sunni stronghold, Islamist stronghold worldwide. This is insanity in epitome. I'm talking about flames and horror and killing and blood before the Mahdi, the Messiah, comes into being. And they are willing, as a wounded animal, an ideological one at that, to promote those 180 signs for the coming of the Messiah. So to speak about speaking or negotiating with these people is almost an oxymoron in the same. It's impossible. It's impossible. Never mind, they themselves say they are not speaking and not negotiating, but let's not believe them. Let's analyze it one level deeper. They are impossible to speak to. So the president, the so-called president who is miraculously alive, of the Islamic Republic of Iran, which I would say raises an eyebrow or should raise an how is that president, specifically he, still alive when many of his colleagues are either in heaven or hell, depends how you analyze. He is the one that is being so-called spoken to, and he is not counted as any kind of weight by the IRCG. He's a figurehead. And again, there is a question to be asked, why is he still alive? So there is no one to be speaking to and or signing an agreement with and or mowing the lawn with.
So Ruth, let me ask you a
It's a different
question.
scenario than Hamas.
Of course, I don't think it's the same scenario as Hamas. Neither of us thinks that. But I'm concerned, as I said, that
Absolutely.
unnecessarily we could end up with a lack of conclusion at the end of this.
Absolutely.
Let me ask you something else. In the event that the deadline is just run through by the Iranians and President Trump starts to bomb infrastructure in Iran along the lines of that which he's discussed and described, and I believe that Prime Minister Netanyahu wants to ensure that President Trump doesn't stop the fighting at this stage. I think that Bibi believes that that would be profoundly against the interests of Israel's near and long-term security considerations. But if President Trump starts to act on his ultimatum, of course, we'll see that the Iranians will intensify their strikes against the infrastructure of countries around them as well. There's also talk about the idea that they're going to blockade the Bab el-Mandeb Straits. There's adjacent to Yemen, where we've seen the Houthis make so many problems, a problem that the Americans were not able to actually make go away when they took them on several months ago, for the viewers who recall that. What I want to know from you is, how do you feel the Gulf countries are set to respond, A, to this ultimatum, right? So there's still these 8.5 hours of feverish negotiations, presumably. What are the Gulf countries likely to be saying to President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu? And how will they respond if Iran does indeed intensify its attacks on their infrastructure?
So first of all, the Gulf countries, some more bluntly and overtly, and the vast majority more covertly. And it's quite obvious the UAE is acting very outwardly on the right side of history and against the Islamic Republic of Iran and terrorism. And Saudi Arabia a little bit more in the shadows, a little bit more than a little bit. But they all have a very clear interest to not have a mowing of the lawn kind of policy, because they're afraid, rightfully so, that if the United States leaves the Islamic Republic of Iran wounded but alive, they'll come back to haunt them, and revenge will be very, very painful. And yes, it will. So they are all whispering in Trump's ear that they expect him to finish the job. Apart from that, they have economic assets of the IRCG that they can block and freeze and make very painful for the Iranian regime. And that is what they've begun doing. And I believe that they should complete the job, because if they and others will freeze the assets that the IRCG has, at the end of the day, the IRCG will wane out. They will not be able to hold, and it may not happen immediately. But the situation in Iran, don't forget, Benjamin, there's a blackout. We don't know the severity of the bombardments and the damage that has been inflicted on the Iranian, not only the weaponry and the armament, but also the infrastructure, etc. It is severe. It is very severe. And everybody is talking about the people not coming out. Well, they will come out. They're awaiting the right moment and the call of the West when to come out. And they will come out. They're awaiting this moment. Not everybody, but a huge majority for 47 years. It doesn't mean that there will be a regime change immediately, but this is the breakdown of an empire, an evil one, of 47 years. It doesn't mean that afterwards, the repercussions, the tectonic repercussions of this breakdown will not be very, very significant, and we'll have to deal with them now, which is the rise of the Islamic Sunni extremism led by Turkey. That worries me. In Judea and Samaria, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Gaza, and worldwide, including the West. But yes, the Republic of Iran in its current form will disintegrate. It almost has no other choice. And with all respect to Pakistan, it will not be able to stop the disintegration of a leadership which doesn't forward the interests of not only the Gulf countries that you mentioned, but the United States of America. By the way, when you negotiate, you don't move huge numbers of both armaments and personnel to war with in the region.
So I'm just to pick you up on the point about the Iranians coming out and taking to the streets. I'm more skeptical on that than perhaps you are. I have been since the outset. I have been since prior to this. We will wait and see. I don't know whether I'm skeptical about it, certainly at the point of being called upon to do so. You're leaving the door open to the idea that they'll do it in their own time, at their own opportunity, in the fullness of time. But the idea that they can be essentially triggered into doing so by a call of an American president or the Prime Minister of Israel saying, now's the time, it's safe to come out. I'm very, very skeptical of that. But I will be happy to be proven wrong, especially if they end up being something that I'm again also skeptical of, namely pro-Western and even pro some sort of relationship with the state of Israel, something that I never bank on until I see it, because history has taught me absolutely not to do so. It's also worth mentioning to the listeners and to the viewers that it's an absurd notion to expect that the Iranian people would come out and take to the streets right now. I say that as an Israeli. Israelis, since this war has been going on, where we have faced a steady, repeated cadence of ballistic missile fire, rocket fire, and so on, what we have done is we have continued with our lives as best we can, but we have remained very, very close indeed to the shelters, whether those be the shelters in our homes, or whether they be the shelters in our communities, or whether they be the communal shelters in areas that we've had to drive to. You and I, for example, both regularly broadcast at I-24. The studios are in Jaffa. You and I both have had to go to the shelter in that building several times during the course of a live broadcast. But the point is, we want to know that there is a shelter proximate to us. The Iranian people are not the beneficiaries of a government that has invested in passive defense, namely the building of shelters in houses, in communities, in towns, in municipalities. And they are living in a country that is currently under the bombardment of the world's only superpower and the region's superpower, the United States of America and Israel, respectively. So the idea that the Iranians would act with an abandon that Israelis are not acting with in the face of far fewer munitions coming into Israel, to me is completely absurd. And I would just
Absolutely.
to everyone to try and understand that, right?
Exactly. And when we sit in studios and explain to people, it's not that the Iranian public is not coming out. They are, a lot of them are sincerely willing, and they've also demonstrated to a significant degree to sacrifice their safety, but At the moment, they are awaiting not the call of the superficial call from the United States of America, but rather the understanding that there is a clearer pathway for them to come out and do their bit. And that's what I believe will happen.
And I think it's a reasonable viewpoint and a reasonable access point to understanding this dynamic, to extrapolate, as I say, from the Israeli experience. You know, there have been times, I remember, for example, there was a speech given when Member of Knesset Benny Gantz was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the equivalent, the Ramatkal in Israel. And in 2014, at a midway point in the war there, Operation Protective Edge, he drove down in uniform to the south and he gave this very mellifluous speech about the Kalaniot springing up and the waters washing away the damage that had been wrought by war, and that essentially it was the end of hostilities. He was absolutely wrong, of course, and I think that Israelis have learned, and I'm sure that the Iranians have learned the very same, that there can be a public announcement, but you reserve the right to hold your judgment before going about daily life, let alone going forward in Iran's case, in the Iranian people's case, and trying to overthrow a brutal regime. So again, I would just appeal to people to understand that. There are two more topics I want to get to, Ruth, for the purpose of this conversation. There is a continued progress of tremendous results inside Iran when it comes to Israel and America being able to tackle the targets they have respectively assigned for themselves. In Israel's case, I want people to be aware of the fact that Majid Hadami, who was the chief of intelligence for the Revolutionary Guards Corps, the IRGC, with a service record of 50 years in duration, who oversaw terror attacks against Israelis who were abroad, who were outside of the states of Israel, and also oversaw the putting down of the resistance by Iranians against this regime. He has been eliminated by Israel. And also Azrael Bahari, who is the head of special operations, was the head of special operations for the Quds Force, that was also responsible. He was responsible for attacks against Israelis abroad, and also the individual who worked tirelessly to establish the terror networks that are proxies of this regime in Iran inside Lebanon and inside Syria. So we are continuing to not only take out the ballistic missiles, to take out the launch capacities and capabilities for those missiles, we're continuing to take out the high-ups within the Iranian regime. There are real successes at play. There's no question about it.
Without a doubt.
So tell me this. Why is the Israeli media so addicted in so many cases to speaking out against the progress that is made during the course of this war and continues to be made? And how do you feel that's affecting morale?
Well, you know what? Every time our reservists come down from Lebanon and or other places and hear the media, it does indeed affect their morale. You know, Benjamin, we're a democratic country in the United States, in Israel, in the West in general. Media has been fed a lot of nonsense for quite some decades. Huge investments were made into the minds of young people. And it sounds almost like a horror film, but after October 7th, we know that this is indeed reality. Into soccer fields, into soccer groups, into cultural clubs, not only in Europe and in the West, but in Israel as well.
You're referring to this phenomenon that's been dubbed sports washing now, when you talk about the soccer teams that have the emblems of some of these dreadful countries emblazoned across their chest, that sort of thing.
Of course, and we know that a lot of infiltration, not only by the Islamic Republic of Iran, but by Russia, China, and other elements, not only in the West, but in Israel as well, has been in effect for a long time. What is the main objective? The geostrategic international objective is to weaken the United States. Israel is a stronghold of the United States in the Middle East. To weaken Israel is to weaken the United States. That is the ultimate goal of Russia, China, and others. To add to that, we have ideological regimes, both on the Shiite side and the Sunni side, that have invested billions. This has already been proved, not by Israeli intelligence, but by other very substantial intelligence, the CIA, etc. Huge amounts of money into the literal indoctrination of an entire generation, including media personalities, not to mention others. And this is indeed relevant to what you have asked. This is very obvious, the demoralization, not to mention the fact, Benjamin, that this is allowed. You can say what you think, you can say what you want, you can criticize. It's good to criticize and to have pluralism, whether it's smart, a correct analysis, not to mention the huge gains that have been very, very apparent, not only in this operation, but in general. It is a mistake. It is demoralizing, but it is, I believe, a phenomenon that is growing and unfortunately will grow more because an entire generation has been literally indoctrinated to believe a completely different story than the one you and I know that is true, believe in, and understand. And that's, it's obvious.
Yeah, I agree with you, of course. It's something that I was lecturing about, including to the American Jewish leadership as early as 2007, 2008, warning about not just the Kuwaiti and the Qatari, but also the Saudi cash that was washing its way through American campuses with strings attached, with
Yes,
curricula built and paid for, with
yes,
chairs at universities endowed.
of course.
Quite frankly, Jewish donors to so many of the universities about which I would speak and of which I would make reference continue to simply pursue the model of donating to those institutions, and there would be a great big plaque on the wall of an auditorium, a beautiful auditorium endowed by a Jewish benefactor, and it would say on that wall, so and so gold fine donated this auditorium in memory of their dear whomever. And in that very auditorium, there was a falsehood, not only about Israel being taught, not only about Jews being taught, but indeed about America being taught. And I always implore people to understand and recognize that what's going on American campuses is not just anti-Israel. It's not just, in many cases, anti-Semitic. It's not just anti the Israel-US alliance, but in my estimation, it is profoundly anti-American in far too many cases. But Ruth,
it's exactly anti-American.
it very much is. But here's my question. I want to try and get you to speak to our listeners a bit more about this. One would expect that Israel would back that trend, that the Israeli media would not be defeatist, that the Israeli media would not be, and I'm going to give a prime example of this in just a moment for my final topic, that the Israeli media would not play ball with that phenomenon. And yet, when you watch the media coming out of Israel and you read the columns in Israeli newspapers, it's all about how we cannot win. There is no positive outcome. There is no ending of these hostilities. You can't disarm this one. You can't disarm the other one. Very defeatist. They seem to almost be infected by a dream of living in Switzerland and aspiring towards a Switzerland existence, if you like, rather than understanding where we are, where we're located as a country, how the region looks at us, who our enemies are, and why we need to take the fight to those enemies. So why is Israeli media continually chipping away at morale? And just to add, I really appreciate what you said about soldiers coming down from the battlefields of southern Lebanon, because I remember that exact phenomenon. I remember in 2006, when I fought in the Second Lebanon War, I was given very, very brief leave to go back to my home in Jerusalem. My parents happened to be visiting at the time, and to gather up some clothes, some additional rations, whatever it was that I wanted, and then to drive right back up to northern Israel in order to go back into southern Lebanon. And while at home in my apartment in Jerusalem, I turned on the news and there was Nasrallah, since dispatched, but Nasrallah was there saying that the rivers of Lebanon are overflowing again, but they're not overflowing with water, they're overflowing with the blood of Israeli soldiers. And I'd just been fighting, including in some of those riverbeds, serving, including in some of those riverbeds. And my father heard this, heard the translation, because it was on the BBC, and he said, how can you go back there? This sounds awful. I said, because it simply isn't true, right? That's not what's happening. I've been in those riverbeds that are being discussed. It's not true, but I did definitely experience what you're talking about, namely the assault on morale propagated by Israeli and international media.
So, first of all, allow me to end with these words. As you know, it's almost Pesach, and we all will celebrate the release and the redemption from a different kind of Ayatollah, namely the Egyptian pharaoh thousands of years ago, which is quite astounding how history repeats itself. And to answer your question, and it would be also astounding to end with that because it's so symbolic. It's beautiful that people can say different things here. It's less beautiful, there's a demoralization. I agree with you, but this is the diversity, the pluralism, the openness of Israeli society, and its resilience inherent in this almost, I would say, weakness. And yes, Israeli society has also been infiltrated to a significant degree by theories, ideas, doctrines that have been literally pushed in a very systematic, very professional, and very sophisticated manner by the former USSR. They invented this. This is the Machiavellian mechanism of pushing ideas to a public. They taught the Islamic Republic of Iran, they taught some elements in the Arab world, and it is unprecedented what this has done. Now, when you are talking about the Israeli, the anti-Israeli, the anti-Zionist sentiment in the United States, it's not only campuses, it's in schools. And it's the anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism is the tool via which to gain a lot of attention, to make it trendy, to make it to exacerbate the idea, but in essence, it's not anti-Israeli, anti-Zionist, or anti-Semitic. It is anti-hegemony of America. Full stop. This is the idea of disintegrating the West from within. It is written in the doctrine of former USSR, current Russian doctrine, Chinese doctrine, and Islamic Muslim Brotherhood on the one side and Shiite extremism on the other. This is the idea. By doing that, you disintegrate a society from within. By the way, the Islamic Republic of Iran has perfected the art. It has disintegrated Syria with the Assad regime, disintegrated Yemen, disintegrated Lebanon for decades, it's trying very, very hard for decades to disintegrate the Hashemite kingdom in Jordan, unsuccessfully because America and Israel are holding that fragile entity in its strength to prevent that. But
Ruth, I have to ask you something. I know you have to go, but I want to appeal to you. I need to appeal to you for 2 minutes because it's so important that people hear your view on this. A sharp pivot, if I may, and please feel free to keep your answer as brief as you need to. We can't leave without talking about Lebanon. Prime Minister Netanyahu has said that in the event of a ceasefire with Iran, we will continue to fight Hezbollah inside southern Lebanon. I want you to weigh in on one issue, only one, okay? And that is the comments by the commander of the Northern Front, Rafi Milo, Major General Rafi Milo of the Israel Defense Forces, about the IDF's preparedness for what awaited us in Lebanon. I don't want you to give a military analysis because I know you don't have the time. I want you to weigh in as a former member of Knesset. Rafi Milo made a comment that he, and I'm quoting here, he said, there is a gap between how we, the IDF, concluded Operation Northern Arrows, that's our previous operation against Hezbollah, and what we understood and thought about the outcomes of that operation, and what we have suddenly found to be the case with Hezbollah. He goes on to say, this is a general in uniform saying this, he goes on to say, I assume this round of fighting, he's referring now to Iran, won't end with some sort of toppling of the regime in Iran. The regime seems to be stable despite what it's experiencing. There will need to be some sort of agreement. Ruth, I'm sure Rafi Milo is a great hero of the Israel Defense Force, a great fighter. But I want to know something. As a member of Knesset, why is this general in uniform speaking? That's number one. He should not be talking about grand strategy at all, or operational planning, or what might be the political outcome of this war. Why is he expressing his views, and why is a country that's so adept at being secretive, such as the planning of the pager attack, why do we have this epidemic of generals and security establishment figures speaking out of turn? Have we learned nothing? How do we stop this?
First of all, as a young country from 1948, we live on the sword, not because we want to, but because our enemies surround us and want us killed completely. You know, Golda Meir said it very clearly. I don't need to repeat. And therefore, a lot of power throughout the years was given, a lot of honor, a lot of prestige, and a lot of space to military leaders. And this has become a norm. A military man in uniform should not speak about strategy. It doesn't matter what he says, whether it's to my liking, to your liking, to anybody's liking. It just shouldn't happen. It does happen every once in a while in this country, again, because this platform of military leadership has become extraordinarily significant given the nature and the importance and significance of the military since the establishment of this country. And God knows, I mean, the civilians of this country and its military, it is a national army. We send ourselves, our brothers, our sisters, our cousins, we all go to the army, and we all feel that it is part and parcel of our own bodies, and not some professional different arm. And therefore we all feel an ownership over what's happening, who is talking, what they're talking about, and so on. Professional military personnel should not be talking about strategy. That's an axiomatic statement to make. The Lebanese front, there's a whole analysis to be had about that.
We'll do it another time. I know that you have to drop, but I do very much appreciate you weighing in, given your background on this phenomenon. You've provided some wonderful context just then. I want to wish you, your family, all the House of Israel, and the Jewish people everywhere, Chag Sameach, Chag Sameach. And Ruth Wasserman-Lande, it's a pleasure having you here at the MirYam Institute. I look forward to the next time. Take care.
It's an honor for me. Thank you, Benjamin. God bless.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for watching this situational briefing on the Benjamin Anthony Show, a product of the MirYam Institute. If you're enjoying this content, please take a moment to hit the subscribe button and the bell to make sure that you get all of the notifications whenever a new episode is released. You'll get to enjoy all of our cutting-edge footage and commentary. And remember, I really do want to hear what you think about our programming. So please be sure to leave your comments and your questions in the comment section below, and I'll see you next time.